Hello everyone and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. I'm Ben.
I'm Sarah, and we have a guest today named Chica.
Yeah.
Who really wants to be right where the recorder sits.
Yep.
On the couch. Oh, Chica.
If you lie down, I'll be cool with it. You just have to not be moving.
You want to come over here?
Good girl. We're dog sitting for some friends of ours. So we have this little dog in the house.
The wizened hound.
She's not a hound.
But, she's wise and old.
Okay.
Yeah, she's great. Hey, if our landlord's listening, we don't have a dog here at all.
Yeah, you can't use this in court. This isn't evidence. Please don't. Yeah, so if you hear some noises, like dogly noises, just deal. How are you doing today, Sarah?
Good. It's not directly after Halloween, but I still do feel a bit of that spook hangover, as it were.
Yeah, I'm very tired.
It was a very busy month for us.
If you've headed over to patreon.com/screamscene podcast, you would have seen that we were putting up music all throughout the month of October, available to patrons of any level, as well as short stories that I wrote. Sorry, the music's by Sarah, the short stories are by me. We had new music and fiction going up right until Halloween itself.
And the last story you wrote was really good.
Oh, thank you.
It was like this crossover of Frankenstein's monster meeting Dracula.
Which, has been done a million times and, we've seen it before, but this is the, Mary Shelley's novel version of the creature and, Bram Stoker's novel version of Dracula, and I feel like I've never seen the literary versions of both characters meet, and I was trying to really write it in, sort of a faux 19th century style.
Yeah, it's like a collection of letters. It's great.
So, yeah, we were releasing stuff right up till Halloween. And then, as I'm sure you all know by now, we released 2 episodes on Halloween in a double creature feature. So, what I'm trying to say, listeners, is I'm just very tired. I'm very tired. I'm a little bit sick. So, Sarah's talking about she has, a spook hangover, whatever that means. I'm just very tired. I'm just very tired.
Now, what might be confusing to people, given that this episode is another continuity insert.
That's right, yeah,
So in terms of release order, you would have just heard episode 84, featuring the man-made monster and Lon Chaney Jr., but what would they have just watched if they just watched episode 47?
Yeah, so if you're listening to the episodes in numerical order, chronological order of the films, you would have just heard the episode on Sex Maniac. So today, we are watching basically the next movie in our continuing retrospective on the early days of Mexican horror films, because we are watching Dos Monjes from 1934.
Okay, and...
Dos Monjes. It's probably Dos Monjes. That's how you say 2, is Dos, not DOS. DOS is an operating system.
It's not super relevant because we're in Mexico, but where does this film sit in relation to the Hollywood production code?
The code is a thing now, and horror isn't. We're in that no man's land where, no one was making horror at all. The next horror film that'll be released in America will be Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. So, the code is a thing, and no one has any idea how to make horror under the code yet. But we're in Mexico, so...
Not really in effect here.
Yeah.
Cultural influence, not even a thing.
Yeah. So, our recent continuity insert on El Fantasma del Convento, we basically are watching this movie now because we just couldn't get a copy until recently. And just like with El Fantasma, there is one now on YouTube, and it is once again time for us to dive into the world of auto-generated, auto-translated subtitles.
We've done it before, we'll do it again.
Dos Monjes is written and directed by one of the co-writers of El Fantasma del Convento. Sort of like how El Fantasma was written and directed by one of the co-writers of La Llorona. So in this case, the writer-director of the film is Juan Bustillo Oro, who co-wrote Dos Monjes with Jose Manuel Cordero. Bustillo Oro was born in 1904 in Mexico City. His first feature film was Yo Soy Tu Padre, which he wrote and directed. Dos Monjes was his fifth feature film credit as a writer and his third credit as a director. He had trained in law before becoming involved in theater and then in film.
The transition between theater and film makes sense to me, but with law?
I mean, to me it always makes sense as like, you go to school to get that like education, to get that real world job, and then like the second your parents are looking the other direction, you switch over to film.
I mean, I guess the talent of being an orator, it translates.
Bustillo Oro had a long career, directing and writing over 60 films over the course of 38 years, and while he worked in many genres, he differed from his contemporary Fernando de Fuentes in that he maintained an interest in horror after these early experiments. In our El Fantasma episode, we talked about how Fuentes was this, great director of Mexican cinema, but he really only made the one horror film. Whereas Bustillo Oro continued to make horror films in the 1950s. So those, along with El Fantasma and Dos Monjes, have earned Oro the title of the father of Mexican horror cinema.
Cool. I presume we'll be watching those later horror movies when we get to the 50s.
Yeah. So, Dos Monjes, which means two monks, as you might guess from that title, continues the Catholic themes of El Fantasma del Convento, and it also continues the expressionist styling of the cinematography, which in this film was done by Agustin Jimenez.
Just for my brain, what did we consider the last German expressionist film? Like, not necessarily from Germany, because that would be...
I'm having a hard time remembering. I know we picked up, like, wafts of expressionist flavor in Fireman Maria.
Yeah.
And certainly the sound remake of Unheimliche Geschichten still had some expressionist elements in it.
Those would be around early 1930s, right?
That's right. You're trying to think of like what the last like true like silent expressionist film we would have looked at was.
I'm just curious what films could possibly be influencing these directors. Like what films' versions of expressionism.
Yeah, I mean, definitely anything from the 20s, for one thing, right? Like your standard, Nosferatu's and Cabinet of Caligari's and Orlok's Hondas and, all that, Alrauna's, whatever. This is 1934, so we're into the prime of the American first horror boom, of course, and yeah, I mean, really 1934, we're at traditionally like what is the end of expressionism, because the Nazis in Germany, what expressionism they're influenced by is all of it, probably.
Sure. Okay.
Another connection to the earlier film is actor Carlos Villatoro, who plays the role of Javier here. He was Eduardo in El Fantasma del Convento.
The one that was married
Yes.
to Christina.
That's right.
Okay.
Dos Monjes was released on November 28th, 1934 in Mexico, and on January 20th, 1935 in the United States. It was not initially well received. The expressionist style, the artificiality of it, these were highly criticized as being like out of date, like old fashioned.
In the States, yeah.
And even like Mexican critics highly criticized this.
Oh, really? Okay.
You might remember like the acting styles in El Fantasma also were like almost like silent movie style acting, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing that was highly criticized in Mexico was the horror themes. one of the things you might remember about this period, after the code, is this is the period of like the strongest backlash against horror, right? And that wasn't just happening in America, that was happening everywhere. That was part of why, after 36, everyone just stopped making horror movies, because the backlash was worldwide, right?
Yeah.
And we were kind of starting to see that around this period. And that certainly happened with this film. People just didn't want horror movies at this time.
But Phantasma was the same year and was, like, very well received.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where, like, that's, the tastes shift, right? It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Everyone goes wild for Sin City, and then 2 months later, everyone is fucking sick of Sin City. You know what I mean? At least that's how I felt when that movie came out. Everyone, like, I remember when that Sin City movie came out, and, like, I was in, like, film studies classes, and everyone was like, oh, this is the new future of cinema. Like, look how stylish this was. Look at the amazing, like, how they were able to get this, like, amazing appearance, and look how this movie was made, and blah, 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 blah. And then it was like, yeah, 2 months later, no one wanted to see that shit ever again.
Look at this new modern take on cinema, as Sin City takes all of its, like, look from 1940s film noir.
Well, I think it was the, like, production methodology of, like, how they got that look in that movie. But yeah. So, in recent years, Dos Monjes has undergone a critical reappraisal. And today, it is actually considered a classic of Mexican cinema. It has been recently restored, and in 2017, the restoration was shown at film festivals as well as at art galleries and museum events to much critical fanfare. Hopefully, this will lead to a high-quality home video release. Even better, if that release gets available in English-speaking territories. But at the moment, that restoration is not just sort of widely available. So we are not watching that. We're watching what was available before that. So yeah, we're in auto-translated YouTube territory again with this one, but that does mean it's on the Scream Scene playlist.
So that's great. People can watch along. They can discover alongside with us just how good of a horror movie this is.
Mm-hmm.
So folks, if you would like to watch along, you can go to screamscenepodcast.tumblr.com. I never realized that rhymes. Huh. You are going to hear a brief musical break, and when we come back, we will discuss Dos Monjes from 1934, directed by Juan Bustillo Oro.
See you on the other side, everybody.
Back to Scream Scene. We just finished watching Dos Monjes from 1934, directed by Juan Bustillo Oro. What did you think, Ben?
Well, I'm glad we watched this movie because we know that, Juan Bustillo Oro is going to go on to make other Mexican horror movies in the future. It also provided a really interesting contrast with El Fantasma del Convento, which it shares a lot of basic themes with.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly very expressionist.
Yeah.
But we got fooled again, Sarah, because this one ain't horror.
It isn't?
I did not think it is. I did not think it was.
Okay, maybe we can discuss that.
Okay.
Just a little bit, talk about what it is if it is not horror.
Okay.
How about you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
Sure. So, as you might surmise from the movie being called Two Monks, we begin in a monastery, and the monks are praying because one of their order is, like, babbling and, like, seems to be having, like, fits and, like, is not very healthy, and they're reacting as if he's, like, got Satan in him, and it has to be drawn out. This movie is set in the past. I want to say the 19th century, but my knowledge of, like, Spanish, like, fashion history wasn't good enough to, like, pinpoint it. But I think 19th century. And so the prior of the monastery sends one of the monks, Brother Juan, to check on this ill monk. He's just like very sick. He's like hallucinating, and he's feverish and this kind of thing. And so he sends Brother Juan to check up on him, and when he does, the feverish sick monk recognizes Brother Juan. This feverish monk's name is Brother Javier. And Javier recognizes Juan and attacks him, and like basically pulls like a big like crucifix down off the wall and like bludgeons him upside the head with it. And this movie's very stylized. There's a lot of heavy contrast in the cinematography. The sets show a very strong German expressionist design. There's also a lot of weird editing. Not like bad, but like clearly the filmmakers are just making choices, and those choices aren't the kind of things that you're normally used to. For example, when Javier beats up Juan, like the sound cuts out. Like there's no thwump, like sound effect at all. It just kind of all goes silent. And it's all shots that are either from one of the two monks, like direct POVs. It certainly makes you sit up and pay attention. So, the monks take the now bleeding Juan away.
And I think Javier doesn't know Juan survived.
Yeah, so the prior comes to see Javier, and Javier is basically like, hey, prior, I'm gonna die. Like, I'm deathly ill. Like, I'm not possessed by Satan or anything. I'm just gonna die. Can you please, like, absolve me of my sins before I died? And the prior's like, you did just beat up a dude, like, with a crucifix. So if you want...
In the scale of, like, sins, that's
Yeah.
probably right near the top.
Yeah, that's some blasphemy. If you want, like, absolution for this, you need to go and seek forgiveness from Brother Juan. And Javier's like, nah, see, that's not going to happen. Because, like, he's my enemy. And, like, God has, like, led me to this place at this time so I can, like, kill him. I have hunted the earth for this man, kind of thing. And the prior's like, okay, you're going to have to explain yourself. So we flash back. And so the story is that Javier is a musician, and he lives across the street from a young girl named Anita, and he plays beautiful romantic music on his piano, and she listens to it from across the street, and he clearly has a big crush on her, but her parents seem to have other ideas, because a suitor comes to her house one day, but she does not care for this suitor, and so her parents decide they don't care for her, and kick her out of the house, and so...
Which is a great response.
I presume the, like, context has to be that, like, that suitor was, like, super wealthy or something, and that, like, that was gonna, like, move the family up the, like, social pecking order. I'm not defending their actions, I'm trying to, like, contextualize them. So they kick her out, they disown her, so Javier and his mother, who he lives with, take Anita in. And then we get some montage showing us how, like, over the time of staying with Javier, they, you know, fall in love and get together, and they're going to get engaged. Javier has this friend, Juan, his best friend, who is in fact the Juan that Javier beat upside the head with a crucifix. Juan has been gone for a few years.
Doing the travel thing?
I mean, yeah, like, he went on adventures in strange, like, faraway places to seek his fortune. And now he's back, and he's rich. And he wants to use his money to, like, support Javier's music and this kind of thing. And Javier's like, oh, like, let me introduce you to, like, my fiancé. Like, this is Anita Juan, Anita. And everyone gets along very well. They spend a lot of time together. Everything's going swimmingly. It's sort of like late fall, and Javier's like, I'm afraid of winter coming, because I have, like, I think it's supposed to be tuberculosis. I have unhealth. I have a bad cough.
I'm in a movie set in the past, and I have a bad cough. I'm going to die.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I'm not going to make it through winter. You know, but he says to Anita, like, if I could just have, like, one spring, like, with you, like, it would all be... I wouldn't even mind dying, like, as long as, you know, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So Javier gets very sick, ends up, he's in bed. There's a doctor looking over him, and the doctor, is giving his prognosis, and Juan's like, shouldn't he go away to some like better climate to get better, which was like a pretty typical like 19th century like prescription for like ailments, was like go live by the sea or something like that. And the doctor's like, no, that's totally not necessary. He's fine. He's gonna be fine. He says to Javier, like, you're gonna live to see your children. Like, don't worry about it. Soon after that, Javier's gotten a bit better. He's back at home. He's still kind of sick though. And Juan's like, hey, I'm going away for a while again, on another crazy Scrooge McDuck adventure.
Well, since Javier was sick, Juan's been very, very distant.
Yes, that's true. Javier's been having a hard time like getting to see Juan. Juan's been a bit evasive. But finally he does come to Javier and say like, hey, I'm planning this big trip, and I need you to go to my lawyer's to look over some paperwork because I have other like urgent stuff to take care of. Like he's got to go down to like the airport and like book his hotel rooms and like get his tickets and stuff and make sure his passport's up to date and these things. Can you go to my lawyer's office and like look over some papers and at this specific time, and definitely don't leave until I meet you at his office? And Javier's like, yeah, for sure, bud, whatever. And Javier and his mother go because his mom's like, hey, you're like sickly and shit, so maybe don't go by yourself. So they go together to the lawyers. Now, a little bit earlier, and I did miss this, when Javier was getting like, when Juan was being evasive and Javier was having a hard time getting in touch with Juan, he talked to his mom about this. His mom was like, yeah, it is weird how much time Juan has been spending with Anita. And Javier's like, what do you mean by that? And his mom's like, what do you think I mean by that? And, they just kind of leave it there. So they go to the lawyer's place, and Javier's coughing up his lungs on the paperwork, and his mom's like, yeah, go home. And the lawyer's like, yeah, go home. Like, your mother can stay here and finish the rest of this, and I'll walk her home. Like, don't worry about it. So Javier goes home, and oh shit, like Juan's hat and cloak and cane are like at the front door, entryway. And Javier's like, what the fuck? And like, sure enough, he finds Juan and Anita, and Juan seems to be like forcing himself on Anita, and she doesn't want it or anything. So like, Javier's like, what the fuck? And he like grabs a cane and he goes and he hits Juan upside the head. Seems to be his standard go-to move. And Juan pushes Anita away from him and then pulls out a gun, and then Anita runs in front of Javier, and Juan fires because he thinks he's firing at Javier, but he's actually shot Anita, and she's dead, and Javier's like, no, and then like Juan disappears into the night, end flashback, and Javier's like, yeah, I lost everything, like my mother died soon after that, and like I didn't have any money, and I searched for Juan for ages, and finally I just, gave up and decided that if I was going to die of this, 19th century disease I have, I'll live out my last days in a monastery. And the prior's like, okay, interesting, yeah, okay, And then he goes to see Juan, and is like, hey, so is any of this true? And Juan's like, yes, but... And we get Juan's version of the story. And at this moment, you're kind of thinking like, oh, it's like Rashomon. This is Rashomon. It's not quite. So the deal with Rashomon is you get the same story over and over again, but it's different every time. Like, completely different, like contradictory. Nothing in Juan's story contradicts Javier's. It's just that Juan's got the rationales and the context for why he acted the way he did. And it's really interestingly done. Like, we see certain scenes, like, straight up again, sort of shot from different angles. And they're different versions of the scenes because there's a very unique, like, visual difference, which is when Javier was telling the story, Javier always is dressed in, like, a white suit, and Juan is in a black suit. And in Juan's version, Juan's always wearing the white suit, and Javier's always wearing the black suit.
Yeah, it was a neat detail.
Yeah. So, turns out, Juan and Anita actually already knew each other. they were already in love and had like promised each other that they would get married to each other once Juan came back from being a traveling adventurer, basically. And then he was gone for 2 years and didn't talk to anyone. So Anita's parents were like, hey, you should get married to, hey, we found you like a nice rich guy to get married to. And Anita rejected that suitor because she had promised herself to Juan. However, in living with Javier, it sort of became clear that Javier's love for Anita was the only thing kind of keeping him going, keeping him alive. So she's kind of felt like obligated to kind of be Javier's like girlfriend slash fiance so that Javier has something to live for. Mm-hmm. And so coming back from his travels, like Juan meets Anita and gets a moment to like talk to her alone to find out like why she's Javier's fiance and kind of learns this. And they're like, you know, that, okay, I guess we have to, you know, you have to stay with Javier for his sake. Then when Javier gets sick that winter, they're kind of on the wavelength of like, okay, stay with him until he dies of whatever is killing him, and then we can get together. And, you know, this explains why Juan decided he had to go away suddenly, because basically what happens is Juan comes to the conclusion that he just, like, can't resist the temptation to be with Anita and, like, break his friend's heart, so he's just gonna go away so that he's out of the picture until Javier dies, and then he can come back and be with Anita.
They feel pretty confident about this plan of waiting till Javier dies because after the doctor was like, yeah, you'll live to see your children, he turns to Anita and Juan and says, actually, he doesn't have a lot of time, so just make it as sweet as possible. You know, make his last few days good.
He actually goes out of his way to, like, basically say, like, any, like, horrible bad thing that he sees will simply make him die quicker. Like, yeah. A weird way to, like, work in, like, yeah, if he found out about you two, like, it would be bad for him. Like, the same, like, Javier's got the same disease that, like, Aunt May had in all those old Spider-Man comics, where, like, if she found out I was Spider-Man, it would kill her from the shock. Yeah, so this is also, I think, why the doctor tells Javier, like, hey, don't worry about going to another climate to get better. Like, in the doctor's mind, it's like, you're going to be dead in a week, my dude. Like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So at one point when they're sort of making these behind-the-scenes plans, Javier's mom comes in and hears them. And so this is why she kind of knew something was going on, but they kind of come to this agreement, like, she's like, yeah, like, keep this up until he dies, right? Like, that's the three-way agreement that they've all kind of got going on. But Juan kind of
needs to see her before he leaves.
Yeah, I need to see you one last time. So that's why he sends Javier off on this, like, whatever errand that doesn't really matter. But of course Javier comes back too soon. And the scene that he was breaking up between Juan and Anna in Juan's version sort of plays like him being like, I just want one last kiss before I leave, and Anna being like, yeah, like, I want to too, but I'm afraid that if I did, like, things would escalate very quickly, and we wouldn't be able to go through with this, like, separation plan. And he's like, oh, but I must, and she's like, no, we can't, and that's kind of the, like, he's forcing himself on her thing that Javier, walks in on. And then, same events occur, Anita gets shot, and Juan is, like, basically just books it and disappears, and he's like, I need penance for my sins, so that's why he went to go live in a monastery. So now we're back in the present.
The prior goes to go check up on Javier to be like, I double-checked your story, whatever. Mm-hmm. But Javier isn't there. He's gone a little more crazy on the organ.
Yeah, he's at the, like, monastery's organ, just, like, pounding it out. I think it's supposed to be, like, his music from before, but man, when you play stuff on a church organ, it definitely, like, just takes on a whole different
little sinister
feel. Yeah, this starts to go into, like, some Phantom of the Opera kind of feels, So all the monks in the monastery kind of get drawn to this because they're like, hey, that's not Ave Maria, and they show up, and yeah, Javier, like, he's so near death, he's so feverish that he's just in full, like, hallucinatory town. And when he sees the monks approaching him, he sees them, like, all as, like, these dudes wearing, like, these big masked, like masks. Like, the masks look like big stylized versions of their heads. Like like as if the monks have like big head mode from GoldenEye 64 turned on.
Yeah.
And they all have a crucifix, like a big giant crucifix to like beat Javier over the head with, like the same thing that he hit Juan with, and they're all, coming at him or whatever. And then
Juan comes in, and at this point, Javier's done his hallucinations, and Juan goes on his knees to be like, oh, please, like, I forgive you, please forgive me, and Javier gets up and walks towards him, but before he can get there, and we see, does he forgive him? Is he going to choke him out? He falls over dead.
Yeah, and that's the end of the movie.
Yeah. So, if this isn't horror to you, what is it?
Well, it's definitely expressionism, right?
Totally.
Like 100%. But for me, the only part of this movie that really honestly, like, this movie's just drama. This is just a soap opera. Like plot. Like, if you just write the plot down, right? This is soap opera. This is melodrama. This is, the same kind of, like, I mean, it's funny because it's in some ways it's the same, like, two best friends and the wife and the cheating thing from, like, El Fantasma del Convento, right? It's like that setup, and we're also in a monastery. Like, it's the same pieces. We're just putting them together
differently.
Yeah, but whereas El Fantasma del Convento had, like, a really spooky ghost story in it, like, this is straight. This is just a straight drama. The thing that makes it not standard is the cinematography and the set design and, like, the cinematic qualities of it, which are definitely expressionist. But as I said a lot of times back in our 1920s days, like, not all expressionism is horror. They get conflated a lot because the most famous expressionist things were horror, but they aren't necessarily the same. And for me, the only moment in this movie that's really, like, that you can point to very easily and be like, that's horror, is at the end when Javier is hallucinating and all the monks are in the super creepy masks and they're coming at him, and there's a lot of cinematic stuff there that's very, like, creepy. But to me, that's still just expressionism, right? Because expressionism is about, like, literalizing the protagonist's
psychological state.
Yeah, into the visuals of the story. But there's nothing really, like, there's stuff in this story where the characters are horrified, right? The characters are horrified by what they've done and by their guilt and stuff like that. But there's nothing, like, scary about this movie. This movie doesn't really, for me at least, seem to be placing horror into the audience. The horror is within, like, the characters are horrified, but the audience, I think, for us, this movie plays more like tragedy. That kind of, the your Shakespeare or Greek styles tragedies that are about, like, I didn't know the whole picture when I acted kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from with tragedy. I have a theory as to why this could be considered horror.
Okay.
And I'll get there in a minute, but I do want to acknowledge that, like, yeah, this movie definitely gets lumped in to overarching horror, because if it is horror, it's very tame. I'll put it that way. But it gets lumped in with more extreme horror because of its expressionism. So I'm totally with you for that. I wanted to ask you, so this is, like, a tough thing to ask because we're both, well, I'm agnostic, you're atheist.
Yeah.
But, like, I'm baptized Anglican, you're baptized Roman Catholic or something.
No, God, no.
Romanian Orthodox.
There we go.
But in any case, neither of us are Catholic.
Right.
And in my Googling, I couldn't figure out just, like, how important is absolution? Like, that's like a big thing, right? Because that's like, cool, your soul will enter heaven, correct?
Well, so I feel like there's a lot of different ideas in play here. Theoretically, like, again, as you said, I'm not Catholic, but to the best of my understanding, like, you need to be baptized. That's, like, your step one for getting into heaven, because that's going to wash you clean of, like, original sin or whatever you had before, like, depending on what age you got baptized.
Yeah.
You need those last rites from a priest, and certainly you need all your sins to have, like, been confessed, right? Like, Catholics do confession, and absolution is the priest after your confession being like, you are forgiven. If your sins aren't forgiven, from what I understand, you are not going to heaven. However, and this is where my knowledge of the theology gets a little foggier, and I think it's also because there's been a lot of theological debate over this over the years. A lot of which is because the whole, like, afterlife, heaven, hell, purgatory, are, souls in heaven alive right now, or is soul sleep a thing? Do you not go to heaven until the last judgment? All this stuff. None of this is really in the Bible. The Bible doesn't sit down and say, here's how this works. It just kind of vaguely references some stuff, and then everyone's been arguing about it for 2,000 years, right? So, to say what my best understanding of this is, my best understanding would be basically to go to hell, like, you had to commit, like, what they call, like, a mortal sin, like one of the 7 deadly sins, whereas I feel like the idea was anything else would just sort of land you in purgatory, and you just sit in purgatory waiting for judgment day, and then you'll get sorted into one or the other. And that was what the whole thing with indulgences in the church was. It was supposed to be like you were paying to speed up someone's time in purgatory so they could get to heaven sooner.
That's just like the busy day at the DMV. You're just sitting there with your ticket forever.
Yeah, and indulgences were, the DLC of Catholicism, where it was like extra, or not the DLC, but like the pay to win, like, stuff.
Sure. It's funny that you mentioned that, because when I Google searched, how big of a deal is absolution? Like, I literally typed that, and results of a franchise called Hitman.
Yeah, Hitman Absolution, the game, yeah, for sure.
Only that came up, and I had to, like, rephrase it to get specifically Catholic results.
Sure. Yeah, if I'm off base on any of this, like, please let me know, because I'm just saying this off the cuff to Sarah in the moment. I have had no time to look this up. Like, Sarah looked shit up, but I did not.
But very briefly, because I couldn't find... Okay, here's the thing. What I could find was a Wikipedia page, a few of them, and also it was, like, way more in depth than what I needed.
Yeah.
Like down to, like, what Russian Catholicism is versus, like,
yeah,
Greece.
everyone fucking... Yeah,
and it was
exactly.
just like, I don't even know. And the other things I got were like, oh, this is, like, a pastor's personal blog of where he writes about Catholicism or whatever. Yeah, that was one thing of, like, how big of a deal is absolution? Like, it's kind of a big deal. The other thing that kind of came up as part of this question and brief research...
Is it horror question? We're getting back to that. We went so many layers deep. I'm just trying to, like,
we
resurface.
Still deep.
Okay, we still deep.
Okay. How important is absolution, like, in terms of hierarchy of, like, importance? What does confession do? Right? Confession is, like, you're telling the dude about your sins, and then the absolution is him being like, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few different parts to this, right? Because there's the priest's absolution where he forgives you for your sins. But oftentimes there's also penance, right? Where you are... That's when, the guy getting your confession, the priest says, like, oh, say 20 Hail Marys or something like that, right? Then you do that penance. That's like paying for your sins. And both of these characters talk about how they've come to this monastery as like a form of penance, but they weren't like officially doing it because they didn't tell anyone about like the thing, right? Like, this is like doing penance without doing confession is like going into county jail by yourself and just sitting there when no one's like sentenced you. It's like if you get arrested for murder at that point, the judge isn't going to be like, well, you already sat in jail for 24 years, so I guess I'm only going to sentence you for the 1 year you would have had left. Like, no, you're still like, it's not a great idea. Like, you have to do confession first. But the most important part is the priest absolves you. You doing confession doesn't do anything really until you get that second part, because it's the priest who's, imbued with the Holy Spirit and the power to forgive sins and stuff like that, right?
So, side question, this is neither here nor there, it's kind of here, but this is more just an academic curiosity. Does the priest have to say, you're absolved? Or is it just like... Because here's the thing. I'm off topic now about my question about whether this is horror or not. Yeah. But
let's dive in.
Yeah, let's dive into Catholicism. We can wrap this up in an hour.
Let's solve all religious problems on this episode of our horror movie podcast.
So, I wonder, so the prior is like, okay, Juan, whatever, and he doesn't, I don't think he says, like, you're absolved or whatever. He just kind of pats his head and gets up and goes back to Javier's. Was he heading back there to be like, cool, I absolve you?
Oh, how much does intent matter versus actually saying it?
Like, verbalizing it. Because here's the thing about rituals, and this is all my academic stuff coming up. If you're at the altar and at a wedding, and your intent is, like, I'm marrying this person.
Right.
But you don't say I do, you're not married.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, like, is that the same thing here?
No, absolutely. The priest has to say the words, right? Like, they're magic words. Like, you shouldn't call them that, but that's what they are. Like, this is part of why, like you asked, like, what words exactly he has to say, and it's going to be different depending on where you are. Because one of the reasons I feel like, so in the 60s, the Catholic Church said, like, hey, you don't have to do rites in Latin anymore. You can do them in the, like, the vulgar tongue of wherever you are, which, like, Latin versus vulgar tongue is, like, was for a long time, like, a big Catholic versus Protestant kind of split, because Protestant churches, you know, the congregations felt like they were much more on par with the priest, like, less separated, less...
Closer to God.
Yeah, less, you know, there was less hierarchy there, because the congregation could read the Bible. It was in their own language, and they could understand what the fuck the priest was saying, and so on. When the Catholic Church got rid of the Latin rites, I feel like part of it was modernization. But I feel like the other part of it was so few people knew Latin by this point that the Latin words themselves had taken on kind of the air of, like, magic words, right? Like, fucking J.K. Rowling uses just straight up Latin as the magic words in Harry Potter. Because, yeah, there's that feeling, like, you know, when you go and you watch the movie The Exorcist, and, like, he's saying Latin stuff while, like, doing hand gestures and things. Like, it seems like some magic shit, when really, like, he's just saying normal things in Latin, right? Like, Latin's a language, it just means things. And so... like, because it's not, you know what I mean? It's not abracadabra.
It's just a language. It means things.
What I'm trying to say is, like, it's not like abracadabra alakazam. It's not a bunch of, like, made-up sounds. It's real words that, Yeah. And so, you do have to say the words. And yeah, all this talk of, like, you know, how important is that? Like, my best guess would be that without absolution, Javier's gonna end up in purgatory at best. Right, he's definitely not going to heaven, but I'm not sure if he's going to hell, because, like, all Javier really did was attack a dude.
Twice.
Well, how justified was he, right? Like, Juan's whole story is trying to give this justification, but Juan pulled the trigger. Like, right? Like, Juan
and brought
murdered.
a gun with him?
Yeah, why does he have a gun in that scene?
Yeah, no, it's that's something.
Dramatic necessity, but it certainly doesn't make, like, sense. So what I'm trying to get across is these questions about the mechanics of this are one of those aspects where, you know, when you grow up in the Western world, where Christianity is kind of almost like an assumed thing.
You're just in the soup of it.
Yeah, but, like, you think you know how it works. It seems really clear until you ask literally any questions, and then depending on who you ask, you'll get 5,000 different answers, and you very quickly find out why there's, like, 1,000,000 different flavors of Christian, because that's why. There isn't an answer. Everyone has a different opinion on what the answer is.
Yeah, so that's why my quick Googling didn't super help. But one thing that kind of ties this back into, is this movie horror?
Yes. Right.
To bring it back to, you know,
the movie.
As ranking every horror movie ever made. So I couldn't find statistics specifically on Mexico 1934. But in 1910, 91% of Mexico was Catholic.
Oh yeah, Mexico is, like, historically, traditionally, you know, probably even up to this day, a very Catholic majority country.
2010, 85%.
Yeah, that number did not go down much, huh?
No. All of this is to say, and I wanted to bring statistics in because I didn't want just, like...
You didn't want to feel like you were generalizing and painting with a broad brush.
And assuming things, because we're pretty far from Mexico, you know?
Yeah.
I wonder, like, if this is an ineffective horror on us because we aren't Catholic.
Right, yeah. Your central question that you've been trying to get to is this horror if you believe in the soul?
Yeah.
Which,
well, like, I mean, like, I believe in the
no,
soul,
but yeah, you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm
right?
I'm just nitpicking.
You're sort of what you're trying to do is use my vampire argument on me. Because, like,
Am I?
Yeah, because ultimately, like, that was my big thing when we talked about vampire, and I was trying to explain why vampire was scary, as opposed to just, like, a collection of weird nonsense thrown together. I was making this argument about, the soul, and how the fear in vampire is the fear of losing your soul, and things like that. And that kind of sat, you were like, oh, that's a good argument. Okay, cool. And we reevaluated Vampire as being like a Catholic movie as opposed to initially looking at it as just like a weird indie art movie, right? So, yeah, I think this is a totally valid argument to bring up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes it horror because the focus feels like it's not on that for so much of the movie.
Yeah, this movie kind of suffers from a bit of the problems that La Llorona suffered from, of, like, a bit too long of the flashbacks.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, what's the point of this movie? Like, not the point in terms of the story, what was the point of making this movie? Because part of me looks at this and says, okay, the point of this movie is to do this double narrative thing, where we have this incident between these two men, and if you see it from this guy's side, he's in the right, and you see it from this other guy's side, he's in the right. And if that's the case, that, Oro is trying to explore telling these dual narratives and how that can be interesting in a film, is the monastery stuff then just, is the frame story just there to facilitate that? Is it just there for an excuse for the other thing? Now, I kind of want to say no, because the ending is so intense and so unique that it feels like maybe the monastery stuff isn't just there to facilitate the rest of the story. But we are certainly in those narratives for a much longer time. I mean, even if you compare this to Rashomon, right? Rashomon has the stuff with the people at the gate into the city. It has the trial stuff, and we're cutting back, I feel, to the present a lot more in Rashomon than we're spending in the scene in the glade, right? Rashomon is flashbacks, this is framing device, in terms of focus and narrative. And even in the context of the framing device, certainly Javier feels guilt, because that's what, this hallucination of these, crazy masked monks coming at him seems to represent. And certainly Juan wants Javier's forgiveness. But, like, I feel like, I don't know if, like, that's what's on Javier's mind, his absolution. I think he just maybe feels guilty, or we don't really know. Like, the movie keeps that really ambiguous at the end, and I respect that choice, but unfortunately it makes the story a bit less clear for me, because if Javier was at the end, like, begging for absolution, and then he just doesn't get it in time, that's horror.
But he was asking for absolution.
But what I'm trying to say is, like, way earlier at the start of the movie, right? It's not emphasized for you in that moment. It's like, it's like if he was dying of thirst, and at the start of the movie he asked for a glass of water, and then at the end of the movie he dies, it feels really disconnected as opposed to if it's right there, you know?
I guess, like, part of the question we have to answer then, in terms of is this horror, is the fact that we don't get an answer from Javier before he dies. Is that supposed to be tragic? Or is that supposed to be horrifying, that it's like he almost was saved, but now he's not?
Yeah, well, and the other thing we have to sort of figure out then is, like, who's the focus on? Like, is our focus on Juan, and, like, oh, Juan will never know if Javier had forgiven him or not? Or is our focus on Javier, and, like, oh, Javier will never get his ... absolution? ... revenge? We don't know. Like, that's the other thing, too, is, like, I feel like it's only horrific if you read it from the context of Javier wants to be forgiven and doesn't get it in time. And I feel like the only way to read it from that context is you have to assume that the movie is more about Javier than it is about Juan, which I feel is hard to do. because it's so evenly split. And also you have to assume that he's going forward to say, I forgive you, not going forward to, like, kill Juan. And because both of those parts of that question are left ambiguous, like, it's hard to say, you know, oh, definitively the theme is this. Well, what's your evidence? Oh, these two things that are completely ambiguous.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's really hard to make an argument by, is my problem with that. You have to make a lot of assumptions to get there. Now, that's not saying it's wrong. It's just that there's no way to prove those assumptions.
Yeah. So kind of where I was going with all this is I looked up other 1934 movies to reorient myself about what horror looked like at that time.
Yeah, for sure.
In order of, like, highest on the list to lowest, there's The Black Cat at number 5.
Yeah, that's something.
Yeah, that's definitely horror compared to this.
Oh, yeah. Black Cat is a fucked up movie.
Oh, it's so good. Then we have El Fantasma at 28. I think comparing these two, it would be very easy to be like, El Fantasma's horror. Dos Monjes is tragedy. Because, like, they're so similar, it's easier to be like,
it's easier to see the difference.
That one's horror.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. It's like, you can be forgiven for, like, not being able to tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but I feel like if you drink both back to back, you'll notice those differences more.
Yeah. And then the next one that I wanted to bring up is Black Moon at number 66.
Yeah, Black Moon. Black Moon, the movie where the horror is
black people. And we were like, yeah, this is horror if you're racist.
Right, so you're trying to figure out, is this horror if you're a Catholic?
Yeah. And what's tough is, Black Moon, the intent was definitely horror.
Yeah.
That question's still ambiguous with Dos Monjes.
Yeah,
All I can say for sure is that the intent was for it to be expressionist.
Yes, definitely expressionist, and certainly at the ending is definitely very intense. My thing is, you know, there's 4 different ways you can read this movie, okay? The movie's about Juan, and Javier wants to kill him. The movie's about Juan, and Javier wants to forgive him. The movie's about Javier, and Javier wants to kill Juan. The movie is about Javier, and Javier wants to forgive Juan. Only in one of those 4 does that make the movie horror. In the other 3, that makes it tragedy. So I think the math tells me it's tragedy, as does the fact that, like, the rest of the movie isn't scary, right? The rest of the movie is just a love triangle told from 2 different points of view that has a murder at the end, right? Like, El Fantasma had fucking ghosts in it and shit.
Yeah,
Like,
the devil howling
and, like,
out
Satan,
the windows.
and, like, yeah, like, mummies coming to life and crap, right? Like, these are the same pieces being put together in a different genre. It's still very creepy at times, and it definitely has that expressionist vibe. But I come down on this isn't horror because I don't think the goal of this movie was to scare anyone. I don't think this movie's trying to put fear into you or be scary. I get what you're saying about, like, the Catholicism and does that make it horrifying or whatever. I think that even if that's true, that reading of the movie, I think this still is tragedy, not horror, because I don't think, if I was Catholic, I don't know if I would walk away from this being like, and then he didn't get his sins absolved! The horror! You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's still...
That's a bit weird, eh?
Like, I feel like that still reads as tragedy, right? It's like, and then, just at the moment when he could have been forgiven, he died. How tragic, right? Like,
yeah.
That's how it reads to me.
Okay, cool.
I did want to make... I get the sense we're wrapping up, and I get where we're going. I did want to say one last thing. It's about the way the colors switch between the two. How one's dressed in black and the other's dressed in white, and then when you get the other guy's story, it switches. So I think, like, the really obvious way to read that is, you know, the guy telling...
You see yourself as the good guy.
Exactly. However, I did just want to bring up this point, and this isn't mine. This is from Will Laughlin of BrainEater.com, who had this to say. But he theorizes that... So there's a scene that plays in both stories that is not plot related at all. it's just part of like montages of the three characters spending time together, but it's the only one that gets repeated, and it's of Javier and Juan playing chess with each other. And what is pointed out on BrainEater.com is that in chess, the white player moves first, and if you want to know, who's in the right vis-a-vis Anita, the key question kind of becomes who had her first, as it were, who made a move first, and from Javier's point of view, he made a move first, and Juan came in on his girl, and from Juan's point of view, like, he and Anita were already together when Javier came in. So that was just something I wanted to quickly bring up, just because I thought that was an interesting point that was brought up by that particular critic.
Just one last note, when we're going through the montage of, like, the three of them together, and it's Javier's perspective, it's like three chums hanging out.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like some friends hanging out. It's great.
It's me and my girlfriend and my best friend. We have so much fun together. Ha ha ha.
Yeah, isn't this great? And when it's from Juan's perspective, during the chess scene, it's different. And Anita is sitting closer to Juan, and she chides Javier for making, like, a bad move.
Yeah.
And, like, changes it for him, and, yeah. And Juan says, I see I'm playing chess with you.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool little details, like the differences between the two versions of the stories, especially in scenes that are the same, are very cool. Like, this is a good movie, I think. Like, this is a very cool movie. I can see why this movie's gotten this, like, critical appraisal over the years. I can also see why it maybe wouldn't have done well in 1934. I think there's a lot of elements to this that speak better to an audience that's, more versed in postmodernism and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, it feels like a very modern movie.
Mm-hmm. And, like, one of my, like you're saying, in these montage scenes, like in the Juan versions, it's like Javier playing his piano while Juan and Anita, like, look at each other like they're just eye-fucking, right? Like, yeah, it's definitely very cool.
So I think we're then both agreed that this is not horror, and thus will be going on the miscellaneous list.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm glad we watched it because I think this is a director we're going to be coming back to again in the future. And also, it was a cool contrast to see with El Fantasma. And like you said, sort of brought out the horror in El Fantasma more clearly.
Yeah. And I think this is a great example for why not all expressionist movies are horror.
Yes.
Like, Al Rauna is another kind of example, but that movie isn't even fully expressionist.
Yeah, that's just a movie. Al Rauna is just an example for why all movies with Paul Wegener aren't horror.
Yeah, very fair. And yeah, I would love to hear from any Catholic listeners, if you watch this movie and you're actually like, no, really, for someone who's Catholic, this is very scary. I would love to hear from you.
Or if any of the stuff that I said out of my ass was wrong and bad and offensive, please tell me, because heaven knows that I have just jumped on Benito Cerino's ass and told him about all the times he was accidentally wrong on Apocrypals and gone, well, actually. So I feel like my Twilight Zone ironic fate should be to have someone else contact me and tell me, well, actually.
Yeah, so you can contact us at screamscenepodcast.tumblr.com through our Ask box, as well as over email, screamscenepodcast@gmail.com, or Twitter @_screamscene. And just a quick plug for Apocrypals. Ben, do you want to tell our listeners about it, since we just had a whole episode about Catholicism?
Yeah, Apocrypals is the podcast by comic book writer and critic Chris Sims, and comic book writer and classicist, linguist, literature luminary Benito Cerino.
A modern man's philosopher, Benito Cerino.
They do it together, comes out every Sunday, and the premise is it's two non-believers going through the Bible and trying not to be jerks about it. It's a really fun show. I highly recommend you check it out if you have not done so already. Our show, if this is your first time listening to it and you want to continue listening to it, this episode didn't turn you off. Our show comes out every Wednesday on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. If you do enjoy the show, we would love it if you could leave a rating or a review on one of those services if it allows them. Another great way you can help us out is just by sharing the show with your friends on various social media platforms or in real life. We are just through with a very big Halloween season for us, and we would love to see our listenership continue to grow. October was a record-setting month for us. We had, I want to say it's like 15% of all of our listens over the whole course of the show were in October of this year.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's, like, so cool.
Another way you can help us out if you enjoy the show is by heading over to patreon.com/ScreamScenePodcast. As we mentioned at the start of the show, patrons get all kinds of fun bonuses. All patrons can still find Sarah's music that she put up over October. None of that's going anywhere. Our Patreon content isn't, like, timed or anything. $1 patrons will also get a special shout-out on air. $5 patrons get access to weekly bonus audio. $10 patrons get access to monthly horror short fiction, and of course each tier gets access to what the lower tiers got as well, obviously. So that's patreon.com/ScreamScenePodcast.
What are we watching next week, Ben?
Next week we are back into the regular flow of the time stream.
1941?
Yes, with Bela Lugosi in Invisible Ghost for Monogram Pictures.
Okay, cool. Will we be able to see it? It's invisible.
My other thing is, like, aren't most ghosts, like,
No,
invisible?
because you can have black figures, you can have spectral orbs. I know about ghosts, Ben.
Okay. I guess you have been watching Ghost Wars. How are the Ghost Wars going, by the way? Are we winning?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it.
We should have, like, newsreels. Like, how...
News from the Ghost Wars front! Alright, well, until then...
We will see you next week, Creatures of the Night.
Bye!
Bye!